Section 4 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 2, Part 2. Galileo. The year 1609 is forever fixed in history through the fact that in that year Galileo invented the telescope. Every good thing is an evolution. Spicilla, or helps to read, had been made and sold privately and mysteriously as early as the year 1400. These first magnifying glasses were associated with magic or wonder-working, the words magnify and magic having a common source and a similar meaning. Magicians wore big square glasses, and by their aid some of them claimed to see things at a great distance, and also to perceive things stolen, hidden, or lost. Occasionally the magician would persuade his customer to try on the glasses, and then even common men could see for themselves that there was something in the scheme. Goodness me! The use of spectacles was at first confined entirely to these wonder-workers, or men who magnified things forever. During the 15th century, public readers and occasionally priests wore spectacles. To read was a miracle to most people, and a book was a mysterious and sacred thing, or else a diabolical thing. The populace would watch the man put on his speculum, and the idea was everywhere abroad that the magic glasses gave an ability to read, and that anybody who was inspired by angels or devils, who could get hold of spectacles, could at once read from a book. We hear of one magician who, about the year 1500, made a box with a glass cover that magnified the contents. This great man would catch a flea and show it to the people. Then he would place the flea in the box and show it to them, and they would see that it had grown enormously in an instant. The man could make it big or little, just by taking off and putting on the cover of the box. This individual worked wonders for a consideration, but fate overtook him, and he was smothered under a feather bed for having too much wizard in his cosmos. A wizard, be it known, is a male witch, and the Bible says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," although it does not say anything about wizards. But please note this: the wizard who had that magic box and flea had really the first microscope. Galileo bought a pair of magic glasses, or spectacles, about the year 1607, and his action in so doing was freely criticized. On a visit to Venice, where glass had been manufactured since long before the flood, Galileo was looking through one of the glass factories, just as visitors do now, and one of the workmen showed him a peculiar piece of glass which magnified the hairs on the back of his hand many times. In a very few days after this, Galileo heard that a Dutch spectacle maker had placed certain queer-shaped pieces of glass in a tube, and offered to sell this tube to the government, so by its use soldiers could see the movements of an enemy many miles away. That night Galileo did not close his eyes in sleep. He thought out a plan by which he could place pieces of glass in a tube and bring the stars close to the earth. By daylight the whole plan was clear in his mind, and he hastened to the shop of the glassmakers. There two lenses were made, one plano-convex and the other plano-concave, and these were placed in a tube made of sheet copper. It was tested on distant objects, and behold, they were magnified by 3. Would this tube show the stars magnified? Galileo knew of no reason why it should not, but he paced his room in hot impatience, waiting for the night to come with its twinkling wonders, that he might verify his convictions. When the first yellow star appeared in the west, Galileo turned his tube upon it, and behold! Instead of twinkling points of light, he saw a round mass, a world, moving through space, and not a scintillating object with 5 points. The twinkling spikes or points were merely an optical illusion of the unaided senses. Galileo made no secret of his invention. It was called Galileo's tube, but some of the priests called it Galileo's magic tube. Yet it marked an era in the scientific world. Galileo endeavored constantly to improve his instrument, and from a threefold magnifying power he finally made one that magnified 32 times. Galileo made hundreds of telescopes and sold them at moderate prices to anyone who would buy. He explained minutely the construction of the instrument, showing clearly how it was made in accordance with the natural laws of optics. His desire was to dissipate the superstition that there was something diabolical or supernatural about the "magic tube," that in fact it was not magic, and the operator had no peculiar powers. You had simply to comply with the laws of nature, and anyone could see for himself. It is hard for us at this day to understand the opposition that sprang up against the telescope. We must remember that at this time belief in witchcraft, fairies, sprites, ghosts, hobgoblins, magic, and supernatural powers was common. Men who believe in miracles make rather poor scientists. There were books about magic, written by so-called scientific men, whose standing in the world was quite as high as that of Galileo. In 1610, Galileo published his book entitled Sidera Medicea, wherein he described the wonders that could be seen in the heavens by the aid of the telescope. Among other things, he said the Milky Way was not a great streak of light, but was composed of a multitude of stars, and he made a map of the stars that could be seen only with the aid of the telescope. There resided in Venice at this time a scientific man by the name of Porta, who was much more popular than Galileo. He was a priest whose piety and learning was unimpeached. The year after Galileo issued his book, Porta put out a work much more pretentious, called Natural Magic. In this book Porta does not claim that magicians all have supernatural powers, but he goes on to prove how they deceive the world by the use of their peculiar apparatus, and intimates that they sometimes sell their souls to the devil, and then are positively dangerous. He dives deep into science, history, and his own imagination to prove things. The man was no fool. He constructed a kaleidoscope that showed an absolute geometrical symmetry, where in fact there was only confusion. He showed how by the use of mirrors things could be made big, small, tall, short, wide, crooked, or distorted. He told of how magicians, by the use of Galileo's tube, could show 7 stars where there was only one, and he even made such a tube of his own, and called the priests together to look through it. He painted stars on the glass and had men look at the heavens. He even stuck a louse on the lens and located the beast in the heavens, for the benefit of a doubting cardinal. It was all a joke, but at the time no sober, sincere man of science could argue him down. He owned "bum" telescopes that proved all kinds of things, to the great amusement of the enemies of Galileo. The intent of Porta was to expose the frauds and fallacies of Galileo. Porta also claimed that he had seen telescopes by which you could look over a hill and around a corner, but he did not recommend them, since by their use things are often perceived that were not there. And so we see why the priests positively refused to look through Galileo's tube, or to believe anything he said. Porta and a few others like him showed a deal more than Galileo could, and offered to locate stars anywhere on order. Galileo had much offended these priests by his statements that the Bible did not contain the final facts of science, and now they were getting even with a vengeance. It was all very much like the theological guffaw that swept over Christendom when Darwin issued his Origin of Species, and Talmage and Spurgeon set their congregations in a roar by gently sarcastic references to monkey ancestry. Amid the general popping of theological small arms, Galileo moved steadily forward. If he had many enemies, he surely had a few friends. As he once had proved more than Pisa could digest, so now he was bringing to the surface of things more truth than Padua could assimilate. Venice, too, was getting uncomfortable. Even the Doge said, in reply to an enthusiastic admirer of Galileo, "Your master is not famous, he is merely notorious." It was discovered that Galileo had been living with a woman by the name of Marina Gamba at Venice, even while he held the professorship at Padua, and that they had a son, Vincenzo Gamba, and 2 daughters. One of the enemy drew a map of the heavens, showing Galileo as the sun, Marina Gamba as the moon, and around them circulated numerous little satellites, which were supposed to be their children. The picture had so great a vogue that the Doge issued an order that all copies of it be destroyed. Of Marina Gamba we know very little, but the fact that she made entries in Galileo's journal, and kept his accounts, proves that she was a person of considerable intelligence, and this, too, was at a time when semi-Oriental ideas prevailed, and education was supposedly beyond the feminine grasp. Galileo did not marry, for the reason that he was practically a priest, a teacher in a religious school, living with and looking after the pupils, and the custom then was that whoever was engaged in such an occupation should not wed. The stormy opposition to Galileo was not without its advantages. We are advertised no less by our rabid enemies than by our loving friends. Cosimo II., Grand Duke of Tuscany, had intimated that Florence would give the great astronomer a welcome. Galileo moved to Florence under the protection of Cosimo, intending to devote all his time to science. In giving up school teaching and popular lecturing, Galileo really made a virtue of necessity. No orthodox lyceum course would tolerate him. He was neither an impersonator nor an entertainer. The stereopticon and the melodramatic were out of his line, and his passion for truth made him impossible to the many. He was treading the path of Bruno. The accusations, the taunts and jeers, the denials and denunciations, were urging him on to an unseemly earnestness. Father Clavius said that Galileo never saw the satellites of Jupiter until he had made an instrument that would create them, and if God had intended that men should see strange things in the heavens, he would have supplied them sufficient eyesight. The telescope was really a devil's instrument. Still another man declared that if the earth moved, acorns falling from a high tree would all fall behind the tree and not directly under it. Father Brini said that if the earth revolved, we would all fall off of it into the air when it was upside down. Moreover, its whirling through space would create a wind that would sweep it bald. Father Caccini preached a sermon from the text, "Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven?" Only he changed the word Galilee to Galileo, claiming it was the same thing, only different, and as a reward for his wit, he was made a bishop. Cardinal Bellarmine, a man of great energy, earnest, zealous, sincere, learned, the Dr. Buckley of his day, showed how that, if the Copernican theory should prevail, it would be the absolute undoing of the Bible and the destruction of the Church, rendering the death of Christ futile. If the earth is only one of many planets, and not the center of the universe, and the other planets are inhabited, the whole plan of salvation fails, since the inhabitants of the other spheres are without the Bible, and Christ did not die for them. This was the argument of Father Lecazre, and many others who took their cue from him. Galileo was denounced as atheist and infidel, epithets that do not frighten us much now, since they have been applied to most of the really great and good men who have ever lived. But then such words set fire to masses of inflammable prejudices, and there were conflagrations of wrath and hate, against which it was vain to argue. The Archbishop of Pisa especially felt it incumbent upon him to bring Galileo to justice. Galileo was born at Pisa, educated there, taught in the university, and now he had disgraced the place and brought it into disrepute. Galileo was still in communication with teachers at Pisa, and the Archbishop made it his business to have letters written to Galileo asking certain specific questions. One man, Castelli, declined to be used for the purpose of entrapping Galileo, but others there were who loaned themselves to the plan. In 1616 Galileo received a formal summons from Pope Paul V to come to Rome and purge himself of heresies that he had expressed in letters which were then in the hands of the Inquisition. Galileo appealed to his friends at Florence, but they were powerless. When the Pope issued an order, it could not be waived. The greatest thinker of his time journeyed to Rome and faced the greatest theologian of his day, Cardinal Bellarmine. The Cardinal firmly and clearly showed Galileo the error of his way. Galileo offered to prove for the Cardinal by astronomical observations that the Copernican theory was true. Cardinal Bellarmine said that there was only one truth, and that was spiritual truth; that the Bible was true, or it was not; if not, then was religion a fallacy, and our hope of heaven a delusion. Galileo contended that the death of Christ had nothing to do with the truth, so science and these things should not be shuffled and confused. This attitude of mind greatly shocked the inquisitors, and they made haste to inform the Pope, who at once issued an order that the astronomer should be placed in a dungeon until he saw fit to disavow that the sun was the center of the universe, and the earth moves. A sort of compromise, it seems, was here effected by Galileo's promise not to further teach that the earth revolves. He was kept at Rome under strict surveillance for some months, but was finally allowed to return to Florence, and cautioned that he must cease all public teaching, speaking, and writing on the subject of astronomy. On March 5th, 1616, the consulting theologians of the Holy Office reiterated that the propositions of Galileo, that the sun is the center of the universe, and that the earth has a rotary motion, were absurd in philosophy, heretical, and also contrary to Scripture. The works of Copernicus were then placed upon the Index, and Pope Paul issued a special decree warning all churchmen to abjure, shun, and forever abstain from giving encouragement, support, succor, or friendship to anyone who believed or taught that the earth revolves. The name of Copernicus was not removed from the Index until the year 1818. Galileo made his way back to Florence, defeated and disappointed. He had not been tortured, except mentally, but he had heard the dungeon key turned in the big lock, and felt the humiliation of being made a captive. The instruments of torture had been shown to him, and he had heard the cries of the condemned. The cell that Bruno had occupied was his, and he was also taken to the spot where Bruno was burned. The place was there, but where was Bruno? He realized how utterly impossible it was to teach truth to those who did not desire truth, and the vanity of replying to men for whom a pun answered the purposes of fact. As he could neither teach nor lecture at Florence, his services to the court were valueless. He was a disgraced and silenced man. He retired to a village a few miles from the city, and in secret continued his studies and observations. The Grand Duke supplied him a small pension, and suggested that it would be increased if Galileo would give lectures on poetry and rhetoric, which were not forbidden themes, and try to make himself either commonplace or amusing. We can imagine the reply. Galileo had but one theme, the wonder of the heavens above. So the years went by, and Galileo, 67 years old, was impoverished and forgotten, yet in his proud heart burned the embers of ambition. He believed in himself, he believed in the sacredness of his one mission. Pope Paul had gone on his long journey, for even infallible popes die. Cardinal Barberini had become Pope Urban VIII. Years before, Galileo and Barberini had taught together at Padua, and when Galileo was silenced, a long letter of sympathy had come from his old colleague, and occasionally since they had exchanged friendly letters. Galileo thought that Urban was his friend, and he knew that Urban in his heart believed in the theory of Copernicus. Galileo then emerged from his seclusion and began teaching and speaking in Florence. He also fitted up an observatory and invited the scholars to make use of his telescope. Father Melchior hereupon put forth a general denunciation, aimed especially at Galileo, without mentioning his name, to this effect: "The opinion of the earth's motion is, of all heresies, the most abominable, the most pernicious, the most scandalous. The immovability of the earth is thrice sacred. An argument against the existence of God and the immortality of the soul would be sooner tolerated than the idea that the earth moves." In reply to this fusillade, in 1632, Galileo put forth his book entitled The Dialogue, which was intended to place the ideas of Copernicus in popular form. Galileo had endeavored to communicate with Urban, but the Pope had chosen to ignore him, to consider him as one dead. Galileo misconstrued the silence, thinking it meant that he could do and say what he wished, and that there would be no interference. A copy of Galileo's book reaching the Pope, his silence was at once broken. The book was condemned, and all copies found were ordered to be burned by the hangman in the public streets. But the book had met with a wide sale, and many copies had been carried to Germany, England, and France, and in these countries the work was reprinted and sent back to Italy. Urban ordered Galileo to present himself at Rome forthwith. A score of years had passed since Galileo's former visit. He had not forgotten it. He wrote to the Pope and apologized for having broken the silence imposed upon him by Pope Paul. He offered to go into retirement again, stated that he was old, infirm, without funds, and excused himself from obeying the order to go to Rome. But excuses and apologies were unavailing. A preventory order was issued and sent to the papal nuncio at Florence. This was the equivalent to an arrest. Galileo must go to Rome and answer for having broken the promises he had made to the Inquisition. If he would not go willingly, he should go in chains. Arriving at Rome, he had several audiences with the Pope, who said nothing would answer but a specific recantation. What Barberini had once believed was one thing, and what the Pope must do was another. Galileo should recant in order to keep the people from thinking Pope Urban would allow what his predecessors would not. The matter had become a public scandal. Galileo tried to argue the question and asked for time to consider it. An order was issued that he should be imprisoned. It was done. Galileo asked for pens and paper that he might prepare his defense. These were refused, and an order of torture was issued. It was not a trial. Defense was useless. Again he was asked to recant. The matter was all written out. He had but to sign his name. He refused. He was brought to the torture chamber. Legend and fact separate here. There are denials from churchmen that Galileo was so much as imprisoned. One writer has even tried to show that Galileo was a guest of the Pope and dined daily at his table. The other side has told us that Galileo was thrust into a dungeon, his eyes put out, and his old broken down form tortured on the wheel. Recent careful researches reveal that neither side told the truth. We have official record of the case written out at the time for the Vatican archives. Galileo was imprisoned and the order of torture issued, but it was never enforced. Perhaps it was not the intention to enforce it. It may have been only a war measure. Galileo was alternately taken from dungeon to palace that he might realize which course was best for him to pursue, oppose the Church or uphold it. Thus we see that there was some truth in the statement that he dined daily with the Pope. That the man was subject to much indignity, all the world now knows. The official records are in the Vatican, and the attempt to conceal them longer is out of the question. Wise churchmen no longer deny the blunders of the past, but they say with Cardinal Satolli, "The enemies of the Church have ever been o'erzealous churchmen." On bended knees, Galileo, a man of 70, broken in health, with spirit crushed, repeated after a priest these words: "I, Galileo Galilei, being in my 70th year, a prisoner on my knees before your eminences, the Cardinals of the Holy See, having before mine eyes the Holy Bible, which I touch with my hands and kiss with my lips, do abjure, curse, and detest the error and heresy of the movement of the earth." He was also made to sign the recantation. On arising from his knees, legend declares that he said, "Yet the earth does move." It is hardly probable that the words reached his lips, although they may have been in his mind. But we must remember the man's heart was broken, and he was in a mental condition where nothing really mattered. To complete his dishonor, all of his writings were placed on the Index, and he was made to swear that he would inform the Inquisition of any man whom he should hear or discover supporting the heresy of the motion of the earth. The old man was then released, a prisoner on parole, and allowed to make his way home to Florence, which he did by easy stages, helped along the way by friendly monks who discussed with him all questions but those of astronomy. Galileo's eldest daughter, a nun, whose home was near his, was so affected by the humiliation of her father that she fell into a nervous decline and died very soon after he reached home. Between these two there had been a close bond of love and tender sympathy, and her death seemed almost the crowning calamity. But once back in his village home at Arcetri, Galileo again went to work with his telescope, mapping the heavens. A goodly degree of health and animation came back to him, but his eyesight, so long misused, now failed him, and he became blind. Thus John Milton found him in 1638. Castelli, his lifelong friend, wrote to another: "The noblest eye that God ever made is darkened, the eye so privileged that it may in truth be said to have seen more wonderful things, and made others to see more wonderful things, than were ever seen before." But blindness could not subdue him any more than it could John Milton. He had others look through the telescope and tell him what they saw, and then he would foretell what they would see next. The policy of the Pope was that Galileo should not be disturbed so long as he kept to his village home, and taught merely the few scholars or servants, as they called themselves, who often came to him. But these were to be taught mathematics, not astronomy. That he was even at the last under suspicion is shown that concealed in the mattress of the bed upon which he died were records of his latest discoveries concerning the revolution of the planets. Legal opposition was made as to his right to make a will, the claim being that he was a prisoner of the Inquisition at his death. For the same reason, his body was not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. The Pope overruled the objection, and he was buried in an obscure corner of the little cemetery of St. Croce, the grave unmarked. So the last few years of Galileo's life were years of comparative peace and quiet. He needed but little, and this little his few faithful, loving friends supplied. His death came painlessly, and his last moments were sustained by the faith that he would soon be free from the trammels of the flesh, free to visit some of the worlds that his telescope had brought so near to him. Galileo was born the day that Michelangelo died. The year of his death was the year that Sir Isaac Newton, the discoverer of the law of gravitation, was born. End of section 4.